Before we do that, we wanted to cover what's happening in Colombia right now because it's a really important moment. And it also shows for our American listeners, even and our European listeners, how prepared the US media system is to manufacture consent on these things and how they're very selective on these questions. So for folks who are not familiar, there have been protests against poverty and a extremely draconian tax plan across the country of Colombia. And it has been met with severe police and military crackdown. And we're talking actual deaths in the street, firing live rounds at people, extreme overreaction to folks who are standing up against a very, very unfair um, tax plan, which we'll get into in a second. So far, 24 people are dead, 87 people are missing, and many, many, many more are injured. The protests started really with a general strike on April 28th, and they are in response to these proposed regressive taxes, um, which the government, run by President Duque, who is a big time right winger, a good friend of Bolsonaro, somebody who, there have been many reports, has privately made promises that he would be interested in supporting a U.S. coup against Venezuela, right? He put forward these extremely regressive taxes that were mislabeled as a solidarity tax or solidarity law. And basically, what this plan was meant to do was to increase revenue for the state by, they said, taxing the rich. But of course, they filled it with so many loopholes that the vast majority of the wealthy would be A-OK, as in addition to international corporations, the 1%. You all know the script there. But they called a solidarity tax, again, in this kind of misnomer, but to make this idea is like, everybody has to step up a little bit. Where the real meat of this tax was focused on was people to the of the lower middle class, through increases in taxes against their income. But where it got extremely regressive was with the VAT, the value added tax, which meant for most people, there would be an increase in taxes on everyday staple foods, everyday goods that you need to survive, oil, things of that nature, right? So this is the kind of classic tax when you come after spending in general in a country. That means that you're going to come after the vast majority of economic activity in the country. And when you live in a country that has extreme poverty and inequality, it means it's going to be an extremely regressive tax. Remember, this is a tax that we fight against a lot in the United States, but was proposed by the looking like potentially future Bitcoin mayor of New York City, Andrew Yang, right? These taxes can be extremely, extremely regressive. But people rose up across the board, led in large parts by unions. And we've seen protests across the country, not just focused in a few different cities. So there's a general strike on April 28th and another one on May 5th. And again, it has been hit with the most brutal state violence crackdown.
Yeah, it's something to see the helicopters meant for, like, presumably the drug war, ostensibly
Mm-hmm.
being used to cower a population into accepting regressive taxes and austerity.
And no, and it's one of those things where this was like, to use a cliche. So I'm still a little bit messed up for my shot, but it's the straw that broke the camel's back. And yes, Duque, they have pulled back the tax, right? They aren't going to go forward with it, but people are still in the streets because they are protesting the extreme inequality and poverty and devastation that they have faced because of this right-wing government's rule. I just wanted to note two things. And the last section of this, Matt and I are going to focus on how this has been covered in the US, right? Particularly how, the OAS and the US, even though they've made their condemnations, because of course you have to condemn it when police are killing people in the streets. It's been very tempered compared to what the United States and the OAS were saying in Bolivia. And we'll get to why that matters in a second. Um, but I also wanted to hit on another aspect. So yes, the government in Colombia is right wing. This is Chicago boy style stuff, right? Cut spending, cut the deficit. at the sacrifice of working class and poor people, right? This is a script we all know very, very well. But why is there such a deep rooted desire to push down the deficit and enforce austerity in the midst of a pandemic in that country? It's because, yes, we can say all the things about the government, bad guy, right wing ideology, all that other kind of stuff. But there is a dependency on international foreign investment. And what do international investors want? They want IMF imposed, one package fits all austerity regimes in order for them to invest money into a country. We saw the same thing earlier in the pandemic in Argentina, right? Under a completely different context, right? But again, this is just another example about how these questions aren't just questions about left and right even. And again, this isn't supporting Duque or anything like that. It's saying that there is a fundamental lack of democracy when access to investment is controlled in an elite, a wealthy elite, right? Even if it's just in your own country, but it's even more exceptional when it's a wealthy elite outside of your country.
Yeah. So who should we get to? Which world leadership to first? Marco Rubio or Evo Morales?
Let's start with little Marco here.
Okay, so little Marco, and I'll make this big for you, David. But he says this: behind much of the violence occurring in Colombia, he uses the hashtags. He's online. This week is an orchestrated effort to destabilize a democratically elected government by left-wing narco-guerrilla movements and their international Marxist allies. Now, he doesn't actually specify Maduro here, but I've seen other, right-wingers say that this is, Maduro. Got his fingerprints all over this.
I mean, it's so funny, too, when they use the terms democratically elected and when they don't, right? We've, in the past couple of years, have experienced a few questions where the idea of, where we were using the phrase democratically elected that were proven, in the claims of fraud against them are proven to be absolutely false.
Right.
And in this case, of course, using the specter of Venezuela is not only useful for Marco Rubio, but it's what they do in Colombia, and it's what they do in Brazil as well. And I think the point that we want to make here is that it's funny when they freak out about these kind of arguments about Venezuela, right? Where again, Maduro wins the election, Chavez wins the election, right? You might disagree with policies. There might be issues that you have with it, right? But these are two democratically elected governments, right? Marco Rubio has no problem with, supporting the dopey Guaido in that scenario, but when it comes to Colombia, they're democratically elected governments. And this is just an example that is so strikingly clear, the hypocrisy of it.
And it was nice drawn in the article we should move to now quickly before we go to Luke, by Ken Klippenstein and Ryan Grimm in The Intercept about the DOJ harassing MIT and CEPR researchers for calling out the OAS fraud claims at the time using like math that was people were doing on Twitter. And people talk about it was great to have Twitter there, but it was also great to have these researchers and this institutional voice saying, hey, wait a second. The analogy Ken and Ryan drew in the Intercept piece was to Trump's attempt on the election in our country, which is the exact same thing, which is you try to call the election before everything can be counted, particularly the parts of the country that don't vote for you. And that's exactly what the OAS tried. And it's funny that.
I think though, I talked about this on the Griscom stream on Tuesday, but I just really want to highlight this again to people, because one, this is not just trying to settle scores or anything like that, but there was a time on the U.S. left even when saying what was happening in Bolivia was a coup was not a popular statement, and there was a lot of fence sitting going on during this, right? And we were covering it. But other than that, there was honestly a lot of people being pro-coup who call themselves left-wing. But again, I do think that people should, do a little bit of reflection if that was the position that they took. But one of the things that was so critical in shifting this narrative was when you started to see these statistical analyses that were coming out of CEPR and out of MIT. And I just want to say it again so nobody mishears it or it doesn't sink into their head. In response to this, the Bolivian coup government called up the United States Department of Justice and encouraged them to ask questions to these MIT statisticians, right? Which there is no other way to frame this other than intimidation,
Mhm.
right? Intimidation of folks who, from the reports I was reading in the Intercept, were very confused at first because the DOJ lawyer kept on calling it Paraguay instead of Bolivia. And that's a funny note, right? And we can, like, it's funny that the DOJ is sloppy, right? But that should not make people think that this was not a serious attempt to stifle criticism, and should not and should also highlight to folks who again are still fence sitting on this other fundamental fact that the coup in Bolivia had US support and backing. This should be just another prime example that that is true. And no amount of fact checks in the New York Times and Washington Post against Evo Morales on this question
What other
can bury the truth on this one.
Yeah, what other institutions come to mind when it comes to the question of the Bolivian election? Like CPR and those MIT researchers were, unless there were others that I'm forgetting, like that's probably the main one. So that the
Mm-hmm.
DIJ is harassing them says an awful lot, I think, about. Yeah, I mean, this is this is a story that needs to be emphasized quite a lot, I think.
Yeah, and I think too, just like looking at the difference in how the initial reaction to what was happening in Bolivia, how that was covered in U.S. media, and obviously by U.S. officials, versus what's happening in Colombia is covered. Even the way that it's being covered by like CNN, New York Times, is almost as if like, oh, there's no prehistory to the protests,
Right.
right? They're actually trying to frame it as like, oh, this is just what's happening in Latin America. There's a lot of anger, right? Instead of actually tying it to why people in Colombia are fed up with this right wing and now terroristic state. I just think a big part of the show focuses on that part of the world, because you will never see as much hypocrisy in U.S. media than the way that they just blatantly lie and bury facts when it comes to the reporting in South America.